All right, Michael, how's it going this morning?
So far, so good. Got my coffee, so we're good.
I got mine. We'll see how the internet holds up for us.
Sounds good.
Um, hey, tell me, I'd like you to share a little bit about like the work that you do right now, currently day in and day out, and
Yeah.
the type of people that you work with, just to kind of give people an idea of what that looks like.
Yeah. So primarily, I kind of, I guess, advertise myself as a family counselor, but I see couples primarily. That's probably the 70% of who ends up in my office are couples. So I see couples, I see families. I probably have about 4 or 5 families that I'm working with right now. And then I do adults, and I only work with, I mean, sorry, males ages 15 and older. Um, and so that kind of keeps me going. I have a couple of young people on my roster and some adult males that I work with. I only see females if I've seen them as a couple.
Okay. What about, we're talking before, how do you think you ended up doing so much couple work? Because there's a lot of therapists who won't see couples at all,
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
some people who are marriage therapists or marriage counselors, whatever, don't always end up with a lot of couples either. So how do you think you got into this or fell into it?
Honestly, so even I've done work with adolescents for a very long time. Honestly, since I was one at 19, so almost 30 years now, just gave you my age. Uh, and so I did so much work with teenagers and realized that there's a real struggle with doing that work with teenagers and then them going home to difficult situations, whether it was parents not together or just parents having difficult marriages or parents not supporting them. So I was like, I really need to be doing work with parents. And that just led to couples work. And then I got involved with restoration therapy and it focuses on couples and initially. And so it just kind of seemed like a snowball thing that happened. I don't think there was ever a point where I said, hey, I want to do couples work. Other than the fact that I saw it as an initial support for young people. And the more I did it, the more I kind of like this and just have continued to do it ever since. And so it was never a directed goal. It's just kind of what has landed and where I seem to sit. I think the other thing is, at least in the Austin area, I am one of few Black male therapists.
Mhm.
And so I think that if someone goes into Google search or whatever it might be, oftentimes, I guess they find my profile or website or something like that. And that's an automatic draw. And then I guess the other thing becomes just thankfully good referral sources where maybe I've worked with a couple or different things and they will say, hey, it goes like literally a new couple I just talked to yesterday in consultation. We're coming because I see her best friend and her best friend told me about them. And that happens pretty frequently.
Do you think, and I don't know this answer in terms of like ethnic groups, is it less common or less likely, let's say for an African American male to feel safe to want to go to counseling than another from another like ethnic group, whether it's Asian, Caucasian? I'm just curious because I don't, know from my own experience. I hear things when I work with an African American male, Black male, they'll talk to me sometimes about that, but I don't have a good sense of that. I'm curious from your perspective then.
I think because I've got a great privilege. If I looked ethnically at my client load, it's actually extremely diverse, which I'm grateful for.
Yeah.
Um, But I see yes and no, right? I think yes, as in I think it's more of there's been historically maybe a stigma around in the African American or Black community around seeking out counseling. I think that's shifting and changing. I would say that the older the male is, probably there's more of that
Yeah.
hesitation. And so therefore there's a definite relief in seeking out. I've had many ladies that may call and say, hey, the only way that my spouse partner who is going to come in is because we have to have a Black man. And so I see that regularly. It's hard to say how that is representative to the greater community.
Yeah.
But I do see it often. But I also see resistance from other men of different ethnic groups
Yeah.
as well. Um,
Well, yeah, you mean you and I know like it's very difficult to get a male in counseling often. And
yeah,
I have two have a lot of wives will say, oh, like they'll call for their husband to kind of see if I'm a good fit. And then they'll
yeah,
say something like, oh, he's not going to talk. And then as soon as they get in, I've never found a guy not to just open up and start
yeah,
talking.
yeah.
And so I do think there's a huge stigma no matter the ethnic makeup, just for males in general.
Hmm.
Um, I know there was some push, we used to do some of the stuff with restoration therapy, like training ministry leaders in different contexts. And sometimes they would talk about their local community and the type of resistance they would face, in terms of getting men in. Um, but I think it says a lot just about the safety a guy feels if they step in the room and they feel like you you're just listening and you're not confronting them right now. You're trying to make it safe for
Yeah.
them. It seems like guys
Yeah.
are willing to open up and share a lot of their life with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's hopefully indicative of all, right? Is
Yeah.
you as a therapist create a safe space for the person that is in your or her persons that are in your office. I think that that is highly important. However, there is something to be said about showing up and seeing someone that looks like you, depending on what that person's experiences are in life.
Yeah.
And so that tears down a number of walls. And so whether it's by gender or ethnicity, there's something that's helpful. I think the other thing is, and this is really why I narrowed my focus to who I see, is the reality is if someone, let's just say a female, gets on and wants to find a therapist and wants a female therapist, well, the options are vast, right? There are many options, no matter ethnicity, there are many options out there because we're in a female dominated profession, right? What for men, there's not as many options.
Yeah.
And then if you have men who are specifically looking for someone of color or whatever it might be, that even narrows even more. And so I wanted to be a resource to men, particularly, and fathers and husbands, where there are not as many options out there for them. So that's part of why I did the focus, as well as trying to make sure that I'm marketing or reaching out to the groups where folks that serve that population know that they have a resource.
Yeah, that's why I wish you were closer because actually when I refer out to people and they're asking for a male specifically, my referral list is actually pretty small when it comes to male.
Yeah. Yeah.
Someone the other day was asking for a male play therapist, and
Oh, wow.
I asked some colleagues, and they're like, "Well, that's basically looking for a unicorn, trying to find that male play therapist." So
I
it's
have actually, there's a guy that's right down the street from me. He has been here forever. He's a psychologist or PhD level, but he stays full. Uh,
yeah.
just because he's a male, but he's been working with kids for a long, long time. And he stays full. I mean, I don't know that I've ever had someone that's been able to get in just because his load is so heavy.
I was trying to think when you and I first met, because I believe we may have spoke at the first restoration therapy conference in 2016,
Yeah, honestly, I've gotten years mixed up.
Pepperdine.
Yeah, I think we met there. I can't remember. Yeah, actually, I look back and I think you were on because remember, well, in the most recent, like, I guess, RT board meeting, they were pulling up old flyers.
Yeah.
And there was a flyer that I think I think you were like a keynote and I was a panelist or something, like in a small, like a breakout room or something. I don't remember.
Yeah, it shouldn't have been a keynote. Terry had me speak on anxiety and fear, and I was like just kind of learning all that stuff. But it goes way back, and I think we kind of knew each other, but I would say over the last couple of years we've had more contact within the restoration therapy community. It's a
Yeah.
model that you and I practice out of,
Yeah.
that was developed by Terry Hargrave. Would you say that's the primary model with which you do couples work?
Yeah, it is a definite go-to. I just did my first level one training of therapists last weekend,
Oh,
um,
that's right.
as a
Okay.
RT trainer. And so yeah, it is my primary go-to.
and we'll unpack that a little bit more, but I was curious about, so when couples come in to see you, what are some of the main drivers of getting people into therapy? Like what are there, I know there's a vast array of issues.
Yeah, yeah.
If you were to narrow them down to, man, these are the two or three things that I think primarily send people in to do couples work, couples marriage counseling, what would those be?
I was recently thinking about this. I think I hear it most often, and I look back at my intake paperwork. One of the very top complaints or issues is communication.
Yeah,
We can't get on the same page. We speak different languages. We can't seem to communicate. We get into fights all the time. So I think just the ability to communicate, and as you and I know, especially with our team model,
yeah,
that becomes that's the mask of
right.
much more that's happening where they're not really even learning how to self-regulate and understand what that means and all those things. And so, but I would be willing to say that's probably the top response. And then you get underneath that, right? Sometimes they're outliners of infidelity or just distance, all right? And they're gotten busy in life, but probably the top is communication.
Yeah, I think it was the marriage and sex therapist David Schnarch, maybe, who said, it's like when a couple comes in and says, we don't communicate well, or we're not communicating. And he's like, you're always communicating. Like if you
Hmm.
walk in and slam the door, you are communicating to one another. You know,
Yeah,
if you're sitting on the opposite side of the couch, you are communicating. And so, yeah, one of the beautiful things about I think restoration therapy is it helps us get below the surface.
yep,
So when a couple does come in and say we're not communicating, well, in fact, you are communicating, but how you are communicating is actually the problem itself, right? And
yeah.
so when couples come in for these issues, how do you I don't know, I'm just curious, like if someone's coming to counseling with you, what are you trying to kind of flesh out in that first session or two, to see number one, if you're a right fit for them and if they're a right fit for you? Like, what do you think is really critical in those first couple of sessions?
Yeah, I think what throws folks off sometimes for myself, right? There's the caveat to that. Sometimes I wish I could sit in and or just watch another therapist because I'm like, this is what I do. I don't know what somebody else does.
Yeah.
Um, I really do my very best to try to get to know the couple and who they are, um, and kind of what their dynamics look like. So it's actually very conversational in that first session. Oftentimes, if that couple is fired up, they're ready to jump in and talk about the issues and fight or whatever it is they want to do in that session. I oftentimes will ask a couple and say, "Hey, what do you want to know about me?" And I'm like, "Hey, you're welcome to ask personal questions, information. You're stepping into a session where you're about to reveal all your own vulnerabilities, and so you're open to ask me questions." I said, "But it's the same as you are. I don't have to answer those questions if I feel like it's inappropriate, whatever it might be." And I feel like that throws people off because
Yeah.
it's like they will say, "Well, I've never thought about what I would ask you," or "I don't know what questions I should have for you." And it just kind of breaks this ice around who they're sitting in the room with and vice versa, and gives them a chance to give information, but it gives me the opportunity for looking for dynamics and who's doing what and how they engage. So that's typically where I start. And then the other caveat, my couple sessions are actually an hour and a half long.
Yeah.
Um, and so once we get that taken care of, we pretty immediately get into what's going on, what's happening. And in our structure for RT, I'm already trying to identify areas of pain and difficulty for them as they're telling me what's going on with them as a couple.
Yeah, couples are surprised. I'm like you. I'm pretty open about things. Let them ask questions and they'll ask me questions and I'll answer that. I think they're kind of shocked sometimes by that, but
Yeah.
I think that's a way to create safety in the room, right? And
Yeah.
I um I was just thinking about like couples work, and would you describe, you and I both were trained by Terry Hargrave, who's just very experiential. Like
Mhm.
it's it's
Yeah.
it's it and I talked to other therapists, like it hits my own feelings of inadequacy sometimes working with him, because then I go back in the room and he's so experiential, and sometimes I don't do that as well as I'd like to in the room. How would you
Yeah.
describe your your approach? Are you experiential? Are you up? Are you moving? You have couples moving? Are you more laid back a little bit and asking a lot of questions? Is it a mixture? Does it depend on the couple?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. I think it depends on the couple. I would say in the last few years I've become more experiential. And some of that is just uh shadowing Terry
Yeah,
with RT and learning and becoming that trainer. But it also has gotten to where because I worked with adolescents so long, like sitting and talking can get old for me. And so I think I've always been that way, especially with adolescents. And so I've tried to figure out what does that look like in a session with a couple. And so I would say it's also another the shot factor for couples is that, oh, we need to do something. There's activity or we're movement or we're standing up or like a couple I just took on yesterday, we were talking through some things and we did a little bit of sculpting.
yeah,
It was their very first session, and they are a couple that have been in therapy multiple times, and they both looked at me like, "What in the world is going on?"
yeah.
So, yeah, I think I've grown into that more than where I probably would have been.
Yeah, several weeks ago, I pulled out some hula hoops that I use for like boundary work and standing in
Uh-huh.
your pain and peace cycle.
Yeah,
And it was an individual session. I had a person kind of moving back and forth between pain and peace and talking about it and trying to get in his body.
yeah.
Um, and I think I was encouraged to do that because I had been talking to our colleague, um, Nicole Sazowski, like
Mhm.
earlier that week and kind of inspired by her. And the person left the session saying to me, my world's never going to be the same again. Whatever you did in that room, it was like magic. And of course, it's not magic, but there's something about getting people
Yeah,
up and moving, especially couples and doing that sculpting work.
yeah.
Um, what what would you say as you're working with couples, no matter the issue, what's like a main point of resistance or like sticking block that you see consistently that we have to get through this if we're gonna make progress in therapy work?
With couples especially, it's this, I think it is, I don't remember who said, maybe it was Terry and all this work we've been doing, but is people love their pain, right? Or at least the way they cope through their pain, or have grown to love it. Maybe it's probably a better way to say that. It's very comfortable. And being able to get across that threshold of, oh, something's different is safe. And I can do that becomes the biggest resistance because I have couples where you might, even if we've been work for a little while, we get their pain and peace cycle down, those kind of things, they will so easily revert back into their ways of coping and trying to, when I call that out or try to help stop those things and redirect it, there's oftentimes resistance because it's like, okay, but this doesn't quite feel safe because it's something new. And so what that might be movement, that might be interaction, or just might be trying something new in their relationship and communication.
Yeah.
And that's really difficult. And oddly, I've actually seen it probably more resistance from ladies. And I don't know if that's because I'm a male and whatever they might be experiencing, but that transition out sometimes can be really difficult. And being able to say, I can try something new, but is it safe to do that?
So change itself is like the sticking point.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, the brain really craves uh things that are familiar, doesn't it? And we don't want to have to think. We just kind of want to react.
Yeah.
So for people listening, let's just imagine you have an imaginary couple in your office. Describe in language like what an imaginary pain cycle might be for a couple.
Mhm. Yeah. So you have someone that so what happens, I probably the easiest thing for me to just kind of give you a scenario, right? Is where you have a couple that comes in and I like most folks, I ask about their history, I talk about their family of origin, those kind of things. But I oftentimes now especially ask couples about their most recent disagreement, argument, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Right. And they start describing that and they will start talking about, I got angry, I shut down, I left the room, I'm cussing, I'm doing right, whatever it might be. What we know are ways of reacting, right? And so I will talk to the couple and say, so if you're angry, as to me, that's a reaction, right? Angry, you're angry because what is below that? Well, I would feel disrespected. I hear that, especially with men, a lot. Well, I feel
Yeah.
disrespected. And then they'll say, okay, so disrespect is also maybe more of that place of something to do with your identity. Someone
Right.
is not showing your value or your worth. You're not feeling loved or honored. Like, help me understand what that is. So we try to go a little deeper to identify that primary emotion, and ask them what's going on underneath that. And sometimes we're able to get to that primary emotion, and less the secondary reaction, right? Secondary emotional reaction, and getting them to begin seeing that, hey, this is what I'm feeling, as you and I know, that violation of love and trust. What's going on underneath that? And let's identify that to see that there's a way of coping, right? And so if it is, I feel alone, unloved, not good enough, unseen. And what does that lead to? Well, I try to make myself seen by being angry. I'm trying to love by chasing after my partner and really pushing in, and that feels controlling to my partner. And so we get that pain initially down for that individual, and then go into how the ways of reacting. I think the obstacle becomes is that their desire to try to go back and forth with, well, he does that, well, she says that, and they go back and forth and trying to keep them focused individually, is really the initial struggle because it's like, hey, I'm really talking about what's happening with you at this moment, how you cope and react. What does that the reaction of others look like? And trying to keep that in a couple setting sometimes can be tough, just because they want to try to push you in another direction. So we get that initial pain word, the reacting, and then we move on to the other person. Sometimes what happens in that session, right, is that if, say, for instance, the guy is kind of walking through his pain cycle, you can see maybe a visceral response from the wife, in the conversation. And once we get there, I will look to the spouse and say, hey, I'm kind of noticing these things. What's going on in you? Let's figure out what's happening for yourself, even as we're talking, right? Oftentimes our pain starts to show up in that time. Let's try
It's
to start there.
it this maybe sound like too strong of a word, but it almost is feels revolutionary when a couple sees their pain cycle mapped out for them on my
Sure.
whiteboard or a chart or
Yep.
something. They're like, oh my gosh, like that's exactly what we do.
It
And
is.
for them to understand the feelings underneath it is it's just so eye-opening.
Yeah. 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 It's really, really I'm really a revolutionary, eye-opening, cathartic, whatever it might be.
Yeah, my first time at the Hideaway, which is a marriage intensive place that you were on staff of, I was on staff of from 2010, 2014. I originally started as what back then called the third chair, meaning I was just being trained. So I would sit and observe the two therapists, and my buddy Todd
Yeah.
Sen was doing the therapy. And so I'm there by myself. I'm not with a couple. I mean, I'm not with my wife. And so I'm mapping my pain cycle out. And that was for someone who'd been to grad school and trained as a marriage and family therapist and same school as Terry, he hadn't been there yet when I left. I went home and I tell this story. My wife picked me up at the airport and we got into kind of a conflict the morning I came back from the intensive. And for the first time in our marriage, I said out loud what I was feeling and
Hmm.
how I coped. And she looked at me like, what the heck? And that changed our life. That changed my life to be able
Yeah.
to understand this pain cycle, this whole
Yeah.
thing. And I just think, I'm glad you're doing this work 'cause I think so many couples go into counseling and they just end up rehashing
Hmm.
experiences and stories, and we give them a couple of tools, and counseling ends up not being a very good experience. Nobody really wants to go back to
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. This is definitely something from Terry Hargrave, but there's this thing that he's talking about how, insight's great.
Yeah.
And insight's really, it's good. But if it stops there, what do you do with it? And so, hey, why are we fighting? Where does it come from? All those things that's really great. But if there's no movement towards change, that becomes couples that's where you begin to see them repeating therapists or taking on many different therapists. And so I really am appreciative of when I have a couple that comes in that maybe, like I said, have been to multiple therapists, and they come in and they will say things like, we did more in this first session than we did in our entire 6 sessions with our previous therapist. So because there's a framework, right? There's a process of helping move a couple through what's going on. And so if we only hover around stories and you come in as a couple and all you talk about is how you fight or you fight in the office, like that's great, but to what outcome? And so oftentimes they firing therapists because they feel like there's no movement.
Yeah, and it can be a challenge as a therapist to try to keep couples moving forward and not
Yeah.
let the chaos of it. Because I found myself many times where I feel like we got mapped out their pain cycle, the peace cycle, and we kind of get off track. And I know we keep referencing Terry. I mean, I think it was a couple of years ago, maybe longer. We would talk about maybe having 60 to 70% insight, 20 to 30% practice. And then I think as soon ago as November when we were all together, I think he literally said we need 20% insight and 80% practice. That couple's got to be practicing
Yeah.
new types of behavior.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
What would you say as you do couples work and even though couples come into you with issues, what have you noticed or identified that are maybe key factors or key contributors to couples like thriving or being successful? That you see like this couple is going to do well because I see these things in them.
Yeah. The number one thing is that openness to change, like to be able to say, okay, we're here to recognize that something's not gelling the way that we're doing it. And so that willingness to receive the counsel and to receive something new to shift. When I see that openness in a couple, that to me is like, okay, there's hope because I'm not spending most of our time just trying to get them out of that pain that's in there, which is still necessary, but I see the hope when I see them adopting and adapting and practicing the tools that are being given. Yeah.
How do you, if someone's listening, how would one, this is maybe tricky, but how would you know if you're not openness to change? Because some people think they are, unless they have the help of somebody else. But if you're
Yeah.
sitting there, if someone's listening and go, well, I'm always open to change, like what are some things that might be indicators that maybe I'm not as open as I thought I would be?
And so I'm pretty direct when it comes to communication and what my observations are. I'm not judgmental. I think I'm just making observations.
Yeah.
And sometimes I can get skewed, but I will just call it out. When I have someone that's giving resistance to me, like if in the process of what's happening, to be able to call it out, it says, I'm very open to change. And I'm like, oh, I hear you saying that, but however many times, right? It's like, hey, this is our fifth session and we're kind of in the same place. We're still having the same conversations. Still seeing the same interactions. So if you're open to change, why isn't change happening? Like what's going on? And unfortunately, what typically may happen is a blame thing, right? Well, because he or she isn't doing what needs to be doing or whatever's happening. I try it and then he comes in and does this or she comes in and does that. So there's this immediate blame that's going on to someone else. To me, that's great opportunity to be able to say, hey, let's go back to the pain and peace cycle about what's going on in you. And it sounds like you're not changing, as in you're not implementing the tools that have been given to you. And so I just kind of confront the elephant in the room when something's going on and just say, hey, what's happening there? I mean, I think that gives you a little chance for more work.
Do you feel hopeful as a therapist that even if one person, at least initially, is doing their pain and peace cycle work, that it can change the whole system, that it can change the marriage?
Um, I'm hopeful. I think I'm also a bit realistic in some things
Yeah.
of if there that might be the reason why change isn't happening is because someone is resistant. But I think for that individual, I remain hopeful, right? Because change is probably going to happen for them, whatever that might look like, but it's coming. So I'm excited about it. It doesn't mean that that's great for the relationship potentially, but I do get excited when someone sees the potential of it, and pretty immediately starts seeing the change because they are implementing the tools.
Something I wonder about, and you and I both come from faith backgrounds, both pastored as well.
Mhm.
Um, I'm going to make a statement here. You don't have to agree with me, but there's a lot of unhealthy stuff sometimes I've seen in Christian counseling where I have couples come in and they're basic they basically say, well, at least we're not divorced. The only goal is not to get divorced, right? As a Christian, let's say.
Yeah.
There's no impetus for change, right? And
Mhm.
so we're just together. And I've always found it, because I work with a lot of Christians and I work with a lot of non-Christians, but
Yeah.
I found it really challenging at times. And I will challenge it for especially couples who are Christian to say it's not good enough just to stay married. Like you have to change,
Yeah.
and that sometimes will lead to conversations around divorce, or does this couple stay together, etc.
Mhm.
I'm just kind of wondering how you navigate that based on your own personal experience and the work that you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, what first thing came to my mind as you start talking about that was, what we talk about in RT is usness.
Mhm.
This concept of like, why are the two of you better together than if you were separate? One of the scariest things for me is when a couple comes in and they've been married 20 plus years or even more than that, and they've never really given a whole lot of idea to who they are as a unique entity in an us. Um, I typically will go there because it's like, yeah, it's one thing that you did the good Christian thing to stay together, but you don't like each other, you don't enjoy similar things, there's no connection that's happening there. How is God glorified in that?
Yeah.
How is he honored in that? It sounds like you're just being obedient to a maybe a religious stance. So I'll just challenge it, all right, and help them see, all right, dude, so you're in here in couples counseling for a reason. Like, what is our outcome? Like, what is our desired outcome? Just to be okay with the fact that you are staying together, or do you want something different? And really challenge them to think about like, what is that, and how is, if you want to pull the faith card, then let's really talk about what does that mean in marriage and what does a marriage look like? Because to me, what you're defining isn't a marriage. It's called you basically just enter a contract. And I don't think that that's what scripture talks about. So I lean into my own
Yeah.
faith, but also into my own training, even spiritually, of I don't think what you're describing is what God has described as marriage. And so we're still not doing it right.
When I was in my last year of seminary at Fuller Seminary, this must have been like 2003, 2002. I had a professor, Dr. Ray Anderson, is well known, and he let me in his PhD class just to audit it, even though I wasn't a PhD student. And
Yeah.
it's on practical theology, and my paper was on divorce. And as him and I were talking a lot, in a lot of his writings, he would compare it to the building of the temple in the Old Testament, which is it's built with this sacred purpose, right? It stands for something. It means something. It's the holy of holy.
Yeah.
Uh, it's a covenant between God and his people, and how they interact with that. But then over time, through the Old Testament, you see the erosion and destruction of it. And what was originally set up as sacred is no longer sacred. And
Yeah.
so much so that Jesus in the New Testament comes and basically talks about tearing it down, right?
Mhm.
And he would say that, marriages often move in that direction, that we get married on that day, we make a commitment to one another, but it gets eroded so much over time that what it originally stood for, it no longer is actually a marriage in and of itself. Does that make
Right.
sense? It's
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
totally opposite of that. It's actually profane. And
Hmm.
but we'll walk around saying, well, at least we're married. And so yeah, it's a tricky thing to challenge at times. You talked about the usness. Would you describe that a little bit more? Terry talks about that us piece. It's obviously really critical to restoration therapy.
Hmm.
If you're talking to a couple who's in your office and you want to talk about the usness, what are some helpful frameworks or metaphors that you use?
Yeah. So I start with the idea that both of them are still very much unique individuals, whether they come from a faith background or not. You're a very unique individual, and will remain that. You're uniquely made, which we both know is part of the violations of love and trust, of trying to figure like where is that uniqueness. And so I just really talk to them about who they are as individuals and that they made a choice, right? Outside of some sort of arranged marriage, they made a choice to enter into this relationship with this other person. And so I will just ask them, hey, what does that mean? Like, what is that that you've entered in? And what do you both uniquely bring, and your similarities and differences? how do those things work together? So we'll have a little bit of a conversation around how are you uniquely made and how sometimes that might contrast with the other person. Do y'all see those differences as divisive or uniting? How do you work together to be parents, to live life, to do those different things? And just get them have a little bit of exploration around let's just define it. Like, what does that mean? Sometimes I'll give them an example of what that means for me and my wife in the process, and help them see how this well-oiled machine works together. But it doesn't exist if the two of them never made the choice to come together. And I try to emphasize this concept of choice just because it's like, hey, outside of someone arranging your marriage, you chose to enter into this. So what are you going to choose to do to enhance this third entity that's called an us? And what are you doing to put some nurturing effort, all those different things that are a part of that process into this usness? I also talk about how, I mean, I ask them questions about their own personal wellness. Do they work out? Do they eat healthy? Like, what are all the things they do to maintain a healthy being for themselves?
Yeah.
And then I transition that over to, so that if this third entity is a real entity, the two of you that didn't exist before you got together, what are you doing to continue a healthy us? What are you doing to nurture this us? And it is oftentimes stumping to many couples because there's nothing. If anything, we get the I oftentimes get sometimes becoming a little bit of a bane of my existence. Sometimes I'll get well, I know his love language and he knows mine, and but he doesn't do it. And right, they automatically start talking about love languages, and I'm like, one of the things that stuck out to me, again, to the man we keep bringing into the room that's not here, Terry, is that in order for someone to go and enact the effort to meet someone's love language, they got to be regulated. And so it's like, well, you're telling me to just go spend quality time with you, but I don't even like you. And so how do I get regulated in that? So just helping them get some level of agency around, why are you even together? Who are you? What does that look like? And what effort are you doing to try to enhance, build, and nurture that us?
Yeah, it's as helpful as that book has been in a lot of ways. I find myself in therapy a lot saying, um, and this is where the peace cycle comes in helpful. Essentially, if you fall apart and can't stay in your own truth because your spouse is not doing your love language for you, that's a real problem, you
Mhm.
know. And so I'm curious if you don't mind sharing, like, can you have an example for you and your wife?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so what's fun is my I always tell things all even in therapy, I'll say my wife and I are complete opposite people. Like, as far as the way we operate, we take any assessment about personality or whatever it might be, we always land on the opposite end of the spectrum of each other. And so I say that because I think sometimes people think this romanticized idea that we're supposed to be a perfect fit and we're supposed to eat, drink, and sleep everything together. And it's like, well, that's just not reality. So I'll start there and talk about how initially in our relationship, probably the first 10 years of our relationship before I was ever introduced to our team. Our differences were oftentimes very divisive for us. I can be pretty type A sometimes. I like order, I like things in their place, I like to plan. She doesn't, any of that stuff, right? And those became ways of contention for us in how to operate in a house where it's like, hey, yeah, we said yes because we liked each other, but living together became a whole nother thing. And so we'll talk about that. I give them a little bit of history, but then I'll talk about we love to throw dinner parties. And I love to cook, love to plan the dinner parties, those kind of things by myself. If I throw a dinner party, I don't know how much fun it is. Like, it's gonna be well organized and everybody's gonna know what time to get there. They're gonna get fed. I don't know how warm it's gonna be, like as far as environment, that kind of thing. But the details are gonna be taken care of, right? If my wife throws a dinner party, you're gonna have a blast and you're gonna feel very welcomed into our home. You may not eat, you may not know exactly what time to show up, right? All those things that the details are not taken care of. So independently, we're capable of doing it, right? Neither one is right or wrong, but we're capable of doing it. When we allow ourselves to get into our peace and work together and throw together, our usness is hospitality in that we truly throw some amazing dinner parties.
Mm.
People show up and they enjoy being there and sometimes don't want to leave. And when we can lean into each other is when I'm in the kitchen trying to task and do all these different things, my wife is a great reminder. Hey, you have people in your home. Come out of the kitchen and connect with the people. In my pain, I see that as an attack, right? You're telling me what to do and yada, yada, yada. I'm not you. But in my piece, I'm like, oh, yes, we got people in our home. Let me go out and interact. Let me connect with the people. Vice versa for her, being like, hey, did you send out the invitation? Did you let people know XYZ, what's going on? In her pain, she feels like that's controlling. As opposed to in her piece, she's like, oh, no, it's an interaction. Yes, I need to let people know what's going on. And so help them see that there's a way that we really can flow well. And it does impact the lives of other people when we're working in our piece. Our usness is truly shows up as opposed to something that divides us.
Yeah. No, that's a really good example. I like that. I was thinking too, like well, I was just thinking like I guess in a lot of marriages, probably you got one person doing all of it or one person not like participating. And what
Mhm.
you're describing is a mutual effort towards something that maybe on their own it wouldn't be their favorite thing, but together it really like is beneficial to them and
For
something that
sure.
they really love.
Yeah.
Is there a specific practice that you and your wife love to do that you think keeps the usness connected or keeps it thriving? You know, like a something during the week that's kind of a point of like this is what we do together just to kind of that makes everything else go.
Uh, So I think we've gotten to where there's just kind of a rhythm that has gotten really good for the two of us. Like we try to check in on scheduling. Like we've got three teenage boys, right? And we try to make sure we're staying connected on what's happening, the operation of our home and all those different things. We make it an effort each night to try to pray together as we're lying in bed, and just having a chance to decompress a little bit. It's always kind of funny because my wife is that person. As soon as her head hits the pillow, she's ready to sleep. And so there's an effort that has to be made to truly just be present, even if it's for 5 minutes, of connecting in those places. Um, I don't know if there's any other direct efforts. We have our regular date nights and all that kind of stuff. But I think the other thing is we do try to make it an effort to consistently work on our marriage. Like it may not be a full-on marriage conference or at their couples counseling, but we try to make it an effort to whether it's sitting and talk about scripture or where we are individually and really make an effort to try to make sure that we are checking in consistently. And how do we support each other in those things? I think the other thing that's really important is like I think part of what helps feed our usness, we have individual lives, like as in interest. That's probably a better word to say that. We have individual interests. There's things I enjoy to do that she doesn't, and vice versa. We have friends that are not mutual friends, that I think feed our soul, that allows us to show up for each other in a healthy way. And I think there's sometimes couples get really afraid of that, of like, well, we're supposed to do everything together, and we're supposed to have all the same friends, and we're supposed to da 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 da. And I don't know that we're meant to be that. But we have those places that feed us in a healthy way that allow us to show up for each other and know what the role of my wife, and me in her life is. And we try to come back to that pretty consistently.
Yeah, there's a lot. I hate to bring it back to maybe the faith piece in terms of this, but there's a lot of pressure sometimes in faith context, religious context. It's not exclusively that. It could be other contexts as well where there's pressure to be really identical, I think, or for one person to give up all their identity for the other,
Yeah.
especially over the years. I think it's changing, but when you get married, it's like I have experienced a lot of couples as the wife feels like she was asked either consciously or unconsciously to give who she is to conform to the husband's sense of identity.
Yeah. Yeah.
What I hear is this really opportunity for both people to be able to express fully who they are and their sense of self and who God created them to be, and that when those two things come together,
Mhm.
that's where the real beauty lies.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think the unfortunately the opposite happens, which is typically what maybe lands people in our offices, is that well we're too different, or he or she's not meeting my needs, or all these unexpected expectations, unrealistic expectations upon who the other person is supposed to be or change to be, based upon my viewpoint. And as we also know, some of that is with what you bring into the relationship, of what you saw from marriage or relationship prior to stepping into that. And so not addressing that is huge. And then the other thing I would say, maybe even the faith community, like I get a little cringy when I have people talk about premarital counseling.
Okay.
And as much as I love and support my pastor friends, all these different things, I think there's a place where we set people up to, okay, let's have marriage counseling, and all we're gonna do is talk about the roles, and we're gonna maybe talk about finances, and you only have sex together, which is important and necessary. I don't want to make sure that comment is there, that's there. Um, right? All of these to-do list, but we don't get into this conversation about like who are you individually, and now you're creating this third piece. What does that look like to have effective communication? What does it look like for these different things? And there's just this maybe sometimes unrealistic blanket of what people create about what marriage is. And therefore, when I get into it, it's not that. So it must be the other person's fault.
Do you run any marital, do you do any premarital stuff ever or any assessments or anything? Or how do
I
you
don't I
approach
don't do any assessments.
that?
No, I used to do the is it symbiosis, whatever. I don't even remember what that is anymore.
Symbis.
Yeah,
Symbis.
symbiosis. I used to do those. I don't anymore. I do very limited premarital. In my office, I'll get some every once in a while. I require at least 6 sessions
Yeah.
is if someone's going to premarital, and then I ask. Now it doesn't happen very often for postmarital to come in and do some things afterwards. Because as you and I know, once I say I do, and if they're not already sleeping in the same bed when they do, it's a whole different story. And so I ask that. It doesn't always happen. If my wife and I do premarital for someone, it's the same stipulations, is because typically it's someone we've met at church or somewhere we know personally, that we're doing that. And it's like, hey, if you're signing up, we're asking you to do a follow-up the next year after you're married. So 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and 12 months out after you're married, we want to talk to you because life is going to be different. And we actually use a lot of the, as you and I know, relate strong format as opposed to maybe the RT format in premarital counseling. If I can help you with self-regulation before you get married, to me, that's like golden. You'll figure out the roles. You'll figure out who's going to wash dishes, um, and all those different things if you can both get regulated. So that's our attempt. So I am
Yeah.
now much more choicey about who and if I do premarital now.
So I was taking some notes as you were saying, because I'm rethinking a lot of this myself, and I run if I do use an assessment, I was trained in Prepare and Enrich many years ago.
Yeah.
And I only actually give it when couples like data, they like want to see something, but I only use that as a jumping off point to help them understand their pain and peace cycle.
Yeah.
I tell them the same thing. The most important thing is within that first year, the first few months, is hopefully come back and let's address some issues early on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I was gonna share something, and that is because I was thinking about the usness, and a practice my wife and I think have really fallen into recently, which has been helpful for us. We wrapped up about a little over a year of just couples counseling, and then we've both been doing individual counseling for about a year and a half. This was kind of like on a weekly basis. And then we're
Mhm.
going through Reengage right now, which is like a church ministry stuff. Um, but I think something that I've really enjoyed is we go out for a walk, maybe right now, maybe 4 to 5 days a week, usually in the evening, before or after dinner, usually with our dog. And we go out for about 3 miles. So we're out for about an hour. And it's not like we have to talk about something specific. It's not like we're trying to solve a problem always. And I think this is how I describe it to couples, is it's the commitment to show up consistently. It creates this like safe emotional environment
Yeah.
that when someone is ready to maybe share something, this is the place to do it. And
Mhm.
it I think there's something beautiful about moving your body and talking as you're walking. It kind of helps, I think, emotionally regulate things.
Mhm.
Um, but for us, I think that walk has been really helpful in like kind of making everything else go. And it's a season of life. It could be something else later on. I don't know
Sure.
if you found something like that you're like, yeah, if we do this thing, or I don't know if you guys enjoy walks. I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, so it's really weird. So my wife and I work out together. She's definitely more committed than I am, but we get about 3 days a week. And obviously we do a group fitness type of thing, so it's not just individually. But they're just, and as you were talking, I started thinking through, there's some things that we do that I think have maybe when we started they were intentional
Yeah.
and we've just been doing them for so long. It's kind of like, oh yeah, we do that. I think there's like we try to make it an effort to turn off the TV and see each other and talk. And like, there's just things that I think are part of our routine now that, like that of, hey, turn it off. You're trying to talk to me. Put your phone down. Let's talk. Or let's sit on the back porch. You know, we live in Central Texas, and so we got limited times where that it's even possible to do because of the weather. In that we are intentional about when we go on a date. For us, with the hecticness of our life, it might be twice a month. When we go on a date, we are intentional about like not talking about the boys. We're not scheduling anything. We're just trying to be in each other's presence and enjoy that. But I think we do it regularly because I could tell when we can't. So as an example, or when we didn't. Last week I was sitting in, we had a really hectic week last week. I did, they did, the kids, and we got to Sunday and we were sitting down and eating dinner. And I said to my wife and kids, I was like, y'all realize this is the first time this week we've sat down as a family and had dinner. And that's a nightly thing for us. It's not just every once in a while, it's usually a nightly thing. And I was like, we this is the first dinner we've all had sitting together. And we haven't done it all week. And they were like, you're right. It hasn't happened. And so I think what happens for us sometimes is in that with the family as well as together is there's certain things we just do. And when we don't, it's like, oh my gosh, we're not doing that. So I think we just kind of built that culture and making sure we're connecting in multiple different ways with the chaos of three teenage boys, their schedule, our schedule. We do our very best to try to make sure we check in.
You know, that's perfect. You went that direction because one of the notes I was writing down, there are I'd call them big issues, meaning they're the most identifiable that bring couples into counseling, like you said, like an affair, like an addiction, some type of abuse, maybe. But the thing that I notice the most, at least in my context where I counsel, the real killer is the busyness in our lives,
Mhm.
because a lot of times that it looks like we're doing good things and we're like out with the kids and we're helping and we're serving, we're doing stuff, but couples don't seem like when there's an affair, an addiction, something that happens in a family, a death, there's this like it's obvious, it's a recognition, but
Right.
man, busyness is like this slow drift often. And
Yeah.
my mentor Todd Sandell would talk about that marital drift. And I remember, I don't know if he used the analogy or someone else did, but it's like, let's say a boat launches out of Miami and it's just a couple of degrees off
Mhm.
heading towards Cuba. A couple degrees off over a period of time is you're
Be
gonna
in the
be
opposite
way off course.
world. Yeah.
Couples come in and I don't think they realize how way off course they actually are after
Yeah.
being married, raising kids, and it can be a really difficult place.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, we both work from a framework called RT, and you had asked me earlier, but I think maybe before we were even on camera, but if that's my primary approach. And I say yes. And the reason I say that is because it's simple. Like, I think that what you're getting at is it's those minor things or the smaller things that make develop into a greater problem. And if we're not identifying those for myself, if my wife's not identifying those and consistently looking at them, they become the greater problem. Or if something big does happen in our life, are we now completely derailed because we weren't working on those small things, right? And so having couples when they come in, one of the biggest things is like if whatever the big elephant in the room is, like you said, some of those affairs or addiction, some of those things, it's really tough because they don't want to look at the smaller things and want to look at some of the contributing factors. I only want to deal with this big fat elephant. And it's like, well, yeah, we do have to deal with the big fat elephant, but we can't only eat the elephant one bite at a time,
Yeah.
right? And so what got us there, what got you there, sometimes that conversation doesn't want to be had because it's
Yeah.
like, well, this person did that, you did that. Well, let's talk about the structure of the marriage, right? What's gone on that led to that? And that's not blaming either one of you or both of you. It is allowing yourself to see what led you there. Again, that does not explain. I think there's some outliners, right? Sometimes choices are just choices. Sometimes it was coming and maybe it wasn't. Those all are the outliners. But by and large, you oftentimes see folks who don't want to deal with the day to day and the simplicity of what makes a marriage strong.
Oh man. Yeah. I've had over the years a couple of different couples like get really mad at me, a person in the one of the spouses, because they come in for something big, and and I and we're talking about it, but I'm moving them quickly also to these simple things. And they're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, no, he did this or she did this. We're not, why are you talking about how I feel and how I cope? And I try to help them understand, we're trying to do all this stuff at one time, but unless you guys address this underlying pattern,
We'll
it's
be
not
back.
going to matter what we talk about.
Yep.
We aren't going anywhere. We could slap a couple band-aids on, and
Yep.
and you'll be back in here or somewhere in a couple of months or a couple of years. Um,
Mhm.
and so that's difficult. Since you're the trainer, people may be wondering, I talked about this with Nicole a little bit as well. Like in a few minutes, how would you summarize RT for people if they're like, okay, what is this RT they keep referencing? What
Yeah.
what would you say in a nutshell and why it's so important?
Yeah. So I think the simplistic way, right? We know that there are two very basic needs that we enter this world with, right? Love and trustworthiness. That love has to do, it answers the question, who am I? Trustworthiness answers the question, am I safe? Right. And what I really love is this conversation around as a child, we come into this world and we need those things. And who's responsible for giving that to us? Our caregivers in our lives, right? And that's without any reciprocation. Like I am expected to be loved and cared for and maintain safety just because I came into this world as a child. And unfortunately, right, life happens and things happens where there's violations of that. And that child begins to figure out how to deal with life, how to deal with themselves, how to self-regulate, all those different things, and develop ways of handling the world and life around them, what we call coping mechanisms, right? We get into relationships, and as we get older, we continue to repeat those patterns that we established very early on. And so we have to look at what were those violations of love and trust. It's not a blaming mom or dad. It is recognizing what happened with life and development that now when you're in conflict or when you are dysregulated, as we call it, or in your pain, what's going on inside of you that you're having a reaction to your spouse, partner, or others in your life. Let's figure out what that pain is, understand what that pain is, what that violation of love and trust is, so that we can regulate it in those moments. And we regulate it by contrasting that with a thing called truth. Who's the truth about who you are? Because in your pain, you're hijacked by your emotions and your feelings, right? And I want to just regulate that feeling. Well, we know feelings change and they are vacillating constantly. And so we have to find a strong foundational tool, find some agency around what is going on within me in that moment. So we contrast with a thing called truth. Who's the truth about who you are? We use different tactics to figure out what that truth is. When I can get grounded in that truth, I have a different way of responding from a place of truth. It may not be my emotions, but we're logically helping the brain see there's different ways to react to things that causes a healthy interaction. When you can do that as a couple, right, you can imagine the great outcomes that come for that individual. But finding that pain is what's really difficult. Well, I take that back. Finding the pain is easy
Yeah.
because many of us can talk about what's going on when I don't feel good, I'm mad, or whatever is up, what's going on. That transition into truth is really tough. And so the regulatory system, what we're doing is our system is off, right? In our midbrain, something's going on and happening that says, take care of myself. Typically, people hear that as fight or flight. In restoration therapy, we call that blame, shame, control, or escape. Something's going on in me, and I got to figure out a way to self-preserve. And I've probably learned that well before I ever got into a relationship with the person that I call husband or wife or partner. I got into this because of what I experienced early in childhood. We are trying to figure out either you don't know how to regulate or to remind you how to do so in that time of conflict. And so we help walk them through that process of learning what self-regulation looks like when you're dysregulated, what's happening within your system, and how can you change that, and probably faster than what they may think if they practice the process. So you're moving from what's called a pain cycle into what's called peace cycle.
And the practice component's big, right? The 4 steps.
Huge. Yep. So really being able to know what's going on in that person individually, what's happening in me. So step one, how do I feel? Right. Step two becomes how do I cope when I feel that way? And that alignment is my feelings are from that violation of love and trust. My coping is blame, shame, control, or escape. Blame others. Blame says you're the fault. Shame says what's wrong with me. Control says, hey, I feel like I am out of control or not safe, so I need to take over. Escape says I need to get out of Dodge, right? So we cope through those things. And once we identify that, that's usually pretty easy. We then move on to step three is what is the truth about you that's going to counter the emotion, right? That third step, that truth is going to counter what I feel. And then since you've identified what the truth is about you, what do you do differently? That's where the choice comes in. I can choose to do something different based in truth about who I am as opposed to what my feelings are saying. And then I move forward in that new decision.
Yeah. So for me, like if I'm in conflict, I'm saying to my wife out loud, or sometimes I'm not saying it. It's just I'm internalizing it. Though saying it out loud is really powerful.
Yep.
A lot of times I'm not around my wife, let's say, but for me, it's always about I feel inadequate. I feel not enough. I feel alone. I feel abandoned. And what I typically do is I cope by trying to perform or achieve. If that doesn't work, I will like numb out or withdraw from a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And over the years, the regulating truth for me is just the idea that I'm adequate, that I have
Yep.
what it takes. Um, for me, it's important to think about my identity as God's son. Therefore, what I'm going to do differently is move towards my wife. I'm going to engage, right? I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
calm some of the anxiety that I carry.
Mm-hmm.
And I sometimes in the RT, we will reference Ephesians 4. Apostle Paul talks about the old self and the new self. And
Yep.
he describes it in ongoing language, like it's a daily task of recognizing the old self at work and
Mm-hmm.
putting on the new. And so, what I try to communicate to couples is this isn't like you got it figured out for good. You might have a season where things are really like going well, but
Yeah.
it's a daily practice of recognizing when I fall into my pain, and it happens multiple times a day.
Yep.
And it's a practice of practicing getting into my truth and doing a
Yep.
new behavior towards my spouse. And that's just a lot of work. And
So
maybe that's the resistance couples face too, is like it just feels like a lot of work sometimes.
I appreciate you stating that, right? Because our pain is our pain, right? And so I oftentimes will tell couples, your spouse is outside of abuse, neglect, or something, an addiction or affair happening in the relationship. Outside of those things, your spouse or partner is not the author of your pain. And
Yeah.
so we in a relationship where is this, well, he does this or she does that. Well, what's triggered inside of you is likely not something that started with your spouse. It's likely something you brought into it. And so your pain is going to show up in places in addition to your relationship, in addition to your marriage. It's going to show up in your workplace. It's going to show up in other relationships. And so the necessity of regulating is extremely important everywhere. And the reactions or outcomes might be different to a degree, but you regulating is extremely important and knowing what's going on in yourself. And that practice only happens when the change, I would say, only happens if you're consistently practicing.
Yeah. And even some of those huge violations that couples come into counseling with, those things maybe just exacerbate an underlying feeling that has already been there their entire life, right?
100%. Yeah.
Um, and you and I are talking about couples work, but I'm also aware of the fact I like we have like the model we can use with individuals, right? Here's this 5 days to a new self
Hmm.
that Sharon and Terry authored. And so this is stuff that you and I do with every individual as well as couples.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I think is I tell people sometimes I'm oftentimes doing individual work in couples therapy,
Yeah.
right? Because it's what's your pain is your pain, and it is impacting this relationship because it's supposed to be the place where I am most loved and I'm most safe. And it feels stronger because it's not happening in this relationship with your spouse or partner, but it does show up in everything else. So therefore, it's very much still an individual thing, and that same conversation can be had in individual therapy, right? Whether they are married, not partnered or not, this shows up still in other places because it's your individual thing.
Yeah, and I think my wife and I would look at our life and say that the reason our marriage is thriving is because the individual work we were doing, because we
Right.
were different people when we showed up. Now, was marriage counseling great? It was, but I think when we showed up to marriage counseling went well because we had been doing individual work. Like there wasn't a lot of wasted time just trying to regulate, right? It was more like we're showing up having done the work, and we can use the
Right.
marital session to really work on some specific things with a third party.
Yeah.
Um, it's kind of too, I've brought this up with some friends of mine who run and oversee like the re-engage, the regeneration ministry at our church.
Hmm.
Um, having done both, I like both. I've taught at both. I work with couples who've done both. But what I've found, and this is just a personal bias, is that I think doing regeneration first, which is the individual piece, which lasts about a year of looking at yourself,
Hmm.
um, was really critical to making re-engage successful. I think if I would have started with re-engage, the couple piece, and then gone into my own piece, I don't think it would have been as beneficial.
Hmm.
But that's my own bias of having done it myself and then like working with couples and seeing it. But I know, anytime you're in a church, if you can get couples to do anything, right, either for themselves or for individual, you're just going to
Yeah.
do it with whatever time frame, whatever limits we have.
Yeah.
But I just say that out loud to say that's my experience too, is that individual work, man, can really just set the catalyst for couples work.
Yeah. I have maybe some of our own colleagues, not just in RT, but beyond that, therapist colleagues, that may not hold the same view. But I oftentimes will do individual therapy with individuals in a couples therapy, right? So I might have a couple and they'd be like, hey, we do some individual work. Maybe I take them on individually, or I refer them to someone either in my practice or beyond that. But it's for that purpose, right? It is because in couples therapy, we're literally sitting in the room of a relationship where there's constant dysregulation. And sometimes there's a barrier there because of what's going on in that relationship. It's still an individual thing, but focusing on that individual sometimes is really tough when they're both sitting in the room. And so being able to say, what individual work do we need to do so that we can enhance the marriage? There's some stuff we've got to work through that, it may or may not be something like an addiction or affair or something like that. But it may just the fact that that person has so much, whether it's trauma, difficulties in their own personal life, that is causing a huge barrier to them being able to do the couple's work. And so we've got to be able to address some of those individual things so that they can see the work happening in the couples. And I think doing that individually is like golden to the work of coming to the work as a couple. One of the things I do with couples, if I do any individual work with anyone in that relationship, I tell them I don't keep secrets, right? Whatever we talk about individual session is fair game in the couple session. So it's not this, I'm not going to triangulate it or any of those things. It's fair game, but it allows you to go depth, so a little bit more depth than maybe you can sometimes in a couple session.
Yeah, I do the same. I'll do some individual work with the couples I'm seeing. I used to back in the day require after the first initial session, at least one or two individual sessions a piece. But I've been more mindful over time with people's time, energy, money, resources,
Yeah.
and try to, and things aren't always go the way in my mind I would like them to go. And so I try to take it as it can come. And sometimes I'll have the couple in here and I'll just tell one person, hey, I'm just going to work with your spouse today, but I want you to observe and to watch and to listen and to be curious so they can kind of be it's like looking through the glass mirror of when when you're being trained as a therapist, people are watching. and then
Yeah.
get kind of like a new perspective on their spouse. Um, at the end of the day, like, it sounds like when a couple's in crisis, anything they can do to try to like get into help, whether it's through a church ministry or counseling, whatever, is super important. What I want to, and we'll go just a little bit longer, but I wanted to ask you about, you are on staff at the Hideaway, you do intensives. Why, talk about that model, why you think that's so important and who could benefit from that? Because I'm thinking we haven't even mentioned that, and that was life-changing for my own work, was to do marital intensives for a while, and I'd come back to my therapy office and feel like depressed because you'd have all these amazing life-changing experiences in the intensive setting for 4 days, and you can't do that in your office sometimes.
Right, right. Well, so the Hideaway is the place where I contract to do intensives. The name is intentional, right? Hideaway, still away, sequester
Yeah.
for a purpose. There's something to be said. You remember back maybe in church camp days, all the things that would happen when you go to camp, and the experience you would have. Why does that happen? It's because you're taking away the distractions of life to truly focus on why you're there and what you're doing when you're there, right? What I enjoy about the intensive model is that you are taking those just the life distractions out of the way to focus on healing, working on your relationship and your marriage, right? And so all of the schedules, kids, daily responsibilities of cooking and cleaning, all those different things are taken away. And all you're having to do is focus on the relationship. And so you get to do a lot of intensive work in that time frame when someone is focused on their relationship and individual needs. And hopefully it's a catalyst to continue that work beyond it. We have the reality. We know the reality is you're not completely changing anything in 4 days, but yet sometimes miracles are definitely happening. And there's some great work and change that happens in that time period. But what we also know is if they don't continue practicing what they learn, they're just going to end up back where they were because of what we just talked about a while ago, right? Is you're not doing the regular practice of that change. And so that model just gives you a chance to focus in on what needs to be addressed. It also allows you, like if there has been some extreme hurt, you can begin the process of understanding what it's like to build back towards forgiveness, healthiness, and togetherness, right? Is you can really focus on that issue while looking at some of the depth of where we are. And I think the other thing, part of that is maybe this is what you're alluding to, but it's really tough, right? And even in an hour and a half, we do some amazing work with a couple, but it's still a
Yeah.
whole other week, sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes a month before you
Yeah.
come back in. And it's like, all right, we're starting all over again because all of those distractions have now been put back into place. And we're having to come back in, and the couple didn't practice. So we're starting all over again. And intensives allows you just to hit it all at once.
Yeah, and just I know the time frame has changed, but to paint a picture, like I used to show up on a Thursday afternoon,
Mm.
and four couples would come in who didn't, know each other. And then there'd be another therapist, so two therapists, four couples, and then there'd be the host couple and the cook. And
Hmm.
we would be in this room around a fireplace, and we would do work in that room, mostly, or we'd have dinner Thursday night together, all sitting together, and then we'd work all day Friday. We'd work all day Saturday. We'd work on Sunday. And this, I might actually come in on Wednesday. I can't remember. And in the couples, we'd have closing dinner on Sunday night. And then my friend and I would fly home on Monday. And so we're eating every meal with these couples,
Uh-huh.
taking every coffee break, sitting out
Yeah.
over snacks with them. I even had to go into a couple's room several times because they were having a conflict and they were calling me in there, like after hours. And so, like, it's a very intense, intimate environment that
It is.
it's really hard to explain and duplicate. And it sounds
Yeah.
scary to people, but man, those couples left really close.
Yeah. 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 Format similar. This still similar. We come in on Tuesday night,
Tuesday.
and it's Wednesday full day, Thursday full day, Friday full day, half day Saturday. Well, until about 2 o'clock on Saturday, intermingled with some traditions of the host couple, Stephen
Right.
Rejan Trafton, that are mingled in there. Two therapists are still part of that process, Occasionally, there's a third chair of a third person coming into the model, but you're both using the restoration therapy model, which really was kind of established at the Hideaway, at least came to birth there. Um, and in that, you have some things, right? There's a place where you have to, as a therapist, even learn what healthy boundaries look like, because even in this intense environment, separation is good. I've gotten to a place where we do eat every meal together. We're in session all day together. I do my very best if we have a small break, not to try to interact, and make ourselves available, because we are giving them the full almost 8, sometimes 9 hours of a day, with these 4 couples, to try to get my own rejuvenation. I try to walk and hike out there and that kind of thing. But it is an environment that's what the focus is. And again, it gives the couple an opportunity to not, you can't run, like it's there. The issue's still in your face. And some of the rooms are set up to where you have some couples that come in that haven't slept in the same bed in years.
Yep.
And there's options to sleep in a different bed. But so it's a very well run process that it's very intimate. Many other intensives you might go to that have multiple couples that are there.
Yeah.
This one is very intimate with 4 couples. I think sometimes a maximum is 5 on an occasion.
Yeah, this isn't a boot camp that's like a 2 day, like, and then you
Right.
go home with like 130 couples at a hotel, right? And those things have their own purpose, but this is a very couples have asked me about it before, and I'm not, this is not the perfect analogy, but I say sometimes it's like I use a football metaphor. An intensive is like taking the ball 80 yards down the field in a 4 day setting versus slowly marching a yard at a time, sometimes in weekly
Yeah.
counseling. Um, I know that doesn't always hold up, but you experience a lot of growth. You do a lot of heavy lifting.
Hmm.
What would you say? And we'll wrap up here, but I was just thinking, if couples are hurting and they're looking for resources, obviously you and I are believers in the work that we do and going to see a therapist. Um, we've mentioned the Hideaway experience, which is outside of Amarillo and the Palo Duro Canyon. There's a lot of crossover a little bit with WindShape, which is part of
Hmm.
kind of the Chick-fil-A nonprofit organization, which is outside Atlanta. They do a lot of intensives. Uh,
Hmm.
I'm a huge fan again of the Regen ministry, which is recovery, and then the Reengage. My church, Hope Fellowship, does a phenomenal job doing that. Those are
Hmm.
helpful for couples. Anything else to mind for you that you would say, here's something that couples could look at or seek out?
I mean, I know that I guess in the RT world, but relates strong. There's material out there for church leaders, that's very helpful, to couples or individuals, families, those kind of things. I think there's something that's maybe it's a lost thing. Maybe it never existed. I don't know now at this point. Is truly making sure that, like, couples, I find that many of them, especially couples who are really struggling, oftentimes are isolated. They're isolated, especially in their struggle, right? They're not engaged in community. And I think we can easily underestimate the value of having people in your lives that are other couples, maybe couples that are even more seasoned, that they're reliable, right? That there are folks that don't have it perfect by any means, but are reliable resources. Because reality is, like, for you and I to come to see us, it's an hour and a half, or whatever it might be, and it's a cost. A retreat or even a intensive is a huge cost. It's an individual life. But doing life with someone, there's no necessarily a financial obligation to that. So there shouldn't be any reason for it not happening. Um, but I find that folks get very isolated,
Yeah,
when it comes to dealing with life. And many people will come in, and whatever they're dealing with, even their closest friends may not even know. Like,
yeah,
say, maybe my best friend individually knows, but we don't have any couples that we are walking through life with.
yeah. I mean, I often tell a couple, it's obviously not my marriage or my life, and I can't demand things, but I say, man, if you could let like one or two people know like what's going on with you guys that you trust, that are safe people,
Yeah.
that's critical.
Yeah.
I knew when I
Yeah.
went through my own challenges in the last couple of years, like people like you, were available to talk to,
Yeah.
lots of friends, lots of neighbors, lots of people, and I can't, that's a good word. I can't imagine like navigating this stuff without a community.
Yeah.
Um, any, I know this is tricky because there's a lot of them. Any books that you recommend that you think are do a really good job on marriage that are accessible that couples could read or look at if they were more interested in not just RT, but in marriage? And by RT, we mean restoration therapy.
Yeah. So this is probably when we start thinking of my weakness as a therapist, which are probably many. I'm not the most resourceful person. And
This is
so,
not your part of the usness that you like.
yeah, exactly. I, and there's some, this might sound like an excuse for it, but at the same time, if I have a list, let's put it that way, I have a list that I hand people,
Yeah,
either books that I've read or books that have been suggested by others. I do have a list that I can email or give to couples that want that, right? Maybe their bent is reading or they just enjoy that. And so I do have stuff I give to people. But also what I've found is many people don't read and implement, right?
no,
Is I can reference a book, and typically the people that love to read and love that those resources have already found them. The struggle is implementation
yeah,
of what they're reading, discovering, and so I really don't offer very often books or resources, and so it's not something I do necessarily in counseling outside of sending that list.
yeah.
Um, and don't necessarily keep a good cadre of that myself.
Yeah, and I have to kind of recommend more podcasts to people and audio or video these days.
Hmm.
If my therapist recommends a book, I'm like on it,
Hmm.
and I've read all of them, but that's like my bent.
Yep.
Um, if people were interested, I think you and I both agree. I'm holding this up. This is a good
Hmm.
start. 5 days to a new self. Um, and I don't want to speak for Sharon. They had the 5 days to a new marriage, but I think that she referenced this as some updated. And if you do the 5 days to a new self, you will understand how that fits into the context of marriage. So I
Yep.
could see people sitting down, and it has daily practice, which is the implementation piece.
Yep.
If people really wanted to nerd out, there's I'm looking on my bookshelf for Terry's book, which Terry's a professor, so it gets into the weeds, right? But there's the
Yeah.
restoration therapy book that Terry wrote. And so some people are really like, hey, walk me through the details. Yeah, what's that? I can't
That
see.
that's his newest. This is the updated version.
Oh yeah, the advanced and
Yeah.
techniques in restoration therapy, which I have not read yet. And that's one
Yeah.
with Nicole helped out with.
It is. It's the one that it's it's very therapy forward, but it's an easy read if you're not a therapist. But it again, someone that likes to read, it's very easy to follow. But it is a therapeutic book as far as professionals, right? For professionals to read.
Well, and couples could, I mean, people could read that and then probably identify their pain and peace cycle using those
Easily.
tools.
Yep, yeah. Yeah, I think that for me, I'm just a very hands-on. This is why I think RT works, but it's also just being mentored by Terry is there is something to be said about getting out of our heads in this level of theory and just putting to practice. Like, okay, it's great that I've read all these books, but what are we doing with it as a couple? So, again, I could see that also as my cop out. It's just not, I like to read myself. But to be honest, my reading I don't do very much theoretical reading. Like when it comes to practice, um, if I'm going to read something, it's completely nothing to do with therapy. But I have a list of things that there are great things out there, great practitioners, theorists, all those different things that are out there. And if I need to, then I match the client to something that's going to be helpful.
Yeah, I read probably 2 months ago, at least according to this researcher, that the latest research shows that if a person practices something 5 hours, a total of 5 hours, and they were talking in the context of like a new type of behavior,
Yeah.
that after 5 hours, they could actually, like with fMRI, scan your brain and see like a new neural network, like kind of
Yep.
being built. And so I mean, 5 hours is nothing.
At all. Yeah. It's
I
just
mean,
getting people to do it, right? It's why the purpose of practice is important. I think, if you look at like, if someone asks, well, how long does it take to change if you're using the RT framework or anything else, in a maybe in a 22-day period, if you practice 18 times, you might start seeing some change, right? It's beginning to see that the emphasis is on implementation. Like, am I going to put to practice what I learned? Which I think is why the frustration happens for couples, is that if they don't walk away with therapy and other than just have talked about something,
Yeah.
it's a struggle because they don't see change, and therefore therapy doesn't work.
Yeah, and that's why you can go to an intensive or a conference or a workshop and talk with your spouse and go over all this stuff, and you can leave. And if you're not consistently practicing that stuff day in and
Yeah,
day out, you're just
yeah,
not going to see the change that you desire long term, you know?
not at all.
And so, well, man, anything else before we close? Any closing thoughts? Anything else that is important that you want to mention at all?
No, I mean, I think there is, I can't remember what we were talking about earlier. I think the one thing to think about was specifically we're addressing the faith community.
Yeah.
Uh, I think there's this constant conversation around whether, do you pray about it? Do you go to counseling? Do you not? Do you do both? What's happening? I think that's something that has kind of been for me for a long time. Is all the above are necessary, right,
Yeah.
for our well-being. I don't think it is church, not therapy, or therapy, not church, any of those things. It's all inclusive. We're whole beings. And if we're not approaching and addressing our entire being, we're going to feel that lack all over the place. And so it's learning what that partnership looks like, and the integration of our faith. I think that's one of the things when I think about where I am here is if people start demographically looking, um, male of color, one of faith, like that number just starts to narrow as
Yeah.
far as access. And so it's really being able to make sure that we have great partnerships across the board. Not that one is better than the other, but they actually can work for the well-being of others, of all.
Yeah, my professor at Fuller Anderson used to talk about being bilingual, and that was being able to communicate both in theological and psychological language and like integrate those things and the
Yeah.
importance of those. And you know, I think the Apostle Paul, of course, people are fond of Philippians 4:6, don't be anxious, but they really leave out the critical piece there. In 4:7 through 9, he talks about these truths, and then he says, meditate on these truths, and then go out and practice. He says, practice these things.
Mhm.
And so he knew in the first century, that there's an importance of taking off the old, putting the new, of putting things into practice. And so things haven't changed that much.
Mhm.
Um, I think, and I'll end with this, but and when I think when things are tough in marriage counseling and just tough in life, the problem is we as couples, we're always looking for the next silver bullet that's just going to fix it. And so we try to find that thing, whether it's another trip, another workshop, another book, another class, when in reality, I tell couples, man, I just want you to have this one tool of restoration therapy, and I want you to become a master at it,
Yep.
as much as you can as being a master, right?
Right.
That
Right.
we're just going to work on this. That's
Mhm.
all. These other things are nice. We can do these at time, but don't be distracted by thinking if you accumulate more tools and other things, it's going to help you. It's not. It's just going to actually pull away from the energy to focus and do the work I think that you need to do.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good. I'd agree.
Well, I appreciate you as a friend. I appreciate the work you do. I've sent people your way before down there in Pflugerville. I've connected you with some friends of mine who were pastors down there. They've really, thought highly of you and enjoyed meeting you and stuff. And it's fun to connect in our restoration therapy community. And you and I might be road tripping to Amarillo here and this next year to a
Yeah,
conference. So
sure,
excited,
man.
excited about that. So thanks for taking the time, man.
Yeah, I appreciate the invitation, and always good to connect and chat. So, um, even if it's in this format, I enjoy it. It's good.
Thanks, Mike. You have a good day.
All right, man. Appreciate it.
Bye.